My name is Dr. Michelle Lam. I'm a Canada Research Chair here in the Faculty of Education. My research chair is in the area of rural community-based education for reconciliation. So what I'm mostly focused on is this idea that education doesn't only happen in buildings, it doesn't only happen in schools, it happens everywhere in life, in the community, places like museums, places like community gardens, even there's a reconciliation run, it's a marathon. These kinds of nonprofits, these kinds of activities all have a role to play in educating the community about reconciliation and about the history of residential schooling, the ongoing impacts of that schooling, and how to work together as a community. Underneath that, there's sort of three themes. So one is this idea that this is already happening. Rural communities are already taking action in this direction. So the first thing is to just find out what is happening and what's working and why, get a sense of how these different communities and how these different organizations are working towards educating their community. The second is around telling stories. And so I've done this in the past through film and through social media. But this idea that what we did in the past with that social media storytelling was kind of a compilation of stories. So we had people tell experiences about racism and then we combined them. But what we lacked in that project, I think, was the ability to let people tell their own stories. And so that's where I want to go now with the CRC. I want to be able to sort of empower people, equip people with the technical skills maybe, to be able to share their stories in public forums if they want, like social media. The second project is going to be bringing people together in place-based groups. So if you think about like People of New York is a pretty famous kind of compilation of stories based around people who live in New York. So imagine like people of Glenborough or people of Thompson, kind of bringing people together in those places for settlers, for immigrants, newcomers, refugees, for people who are from Indigenous communities to come together in a particular place and tell stories about how living in that place influences their ideas about one another. If you grew up like I did in Foxhorn, Manitoba, living in Foxhorn, Manitoba influences my ideas about people who come to my community, come to Canada, people who've lived there for time immemorial, and how we relate to one another. So that's sort of the second. And then the third project is kind of launching those stories on social media as a form of public pedagogy. So we're moving from sort of the place-based stories into a broader sphere, if people want, and then how to do that in a good way, because some of those stories are vulnerable, and so how to care for those stories as they go out into the world. Storytelling has been around forever, but the idea of public pedagogy and using stories in that way, I think, is really, really interesting to me. So using kind of an arts-based pedagogy and combining it with stories, what we saw in the anti-racism films that we did was that stories beget stories, and that's a quote from two famous duo ethnographers, Norris and Sawyer. But this idea that as we tell stories, it inspires other people to tell stories, and we really saw that happening in the anti-racism film project, where people on TikTok would take our film and snip a bit of it and put it on their channel, and then their followers would start telling stories. And so those were stories about racism and the things that people are experiencing. But imagine if we could tell stories about one another in ways that work towards reconciliation. And so that's really what I want to work on and put forward into the world. As we think about storytelling and the kinds of stories we tell, here in Canada, Indigenous communities have stories of colonization, they have stories of resurgence, they have stories of reclamation, they have stories of strength, but there are stories in other countries too, and there's so many resonances between those stories. And so former colonial states in New Zealand or Australia or places everywhere around the world where colonization was a thing have stories to contribute. And so I'm hoping that this kind of methodology of creating stories at the local level and then bringing them into a public sphere as a way of educating publicly, I think that has the ability or the potential to be really impactful in many different contexts. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot, and I don't yet know how to address, but I think it needs to be handled really carefully, is this idea that people's stories are something that is so precious. It's a gift. And so often when we're doing storytelling, we do it in a community that we know one another and we trust one another, and there's vulnerability in that process. And so when you think about taking those stories and putting them into somewhere like social media, where you don't always control how it's going to be used, or you don't always have an idea how it's going to land with someone, that takes the vulnerability and just expands it. And so that's something that I think is going to need really careful attention to the ethics of it and to making sure that people are cared for along the way in the process. So storytelling by yourself isn't really a fun thing to do. On campus, we have other Canada research chairs. Both Jonathan Allen and Rachel Heron are two wonderful people that I've already started collaborating with, and I'm eager to continue that. So those are two Canada research chairs here. In addition to that, there are faculty members in education who do work in reconciliation, who do work with storytelling, who do work with duo ethnography. We have many potentials for collaboration and areas that we've already worked together, and also across campus. I hope that people feel like the Canada Research Chair had the ability to elevate people's stories in a way that they felt like they were in control of the process, where if they wanted their stories to go farther, the Canada Research Chair could be a vehicle for allowing that to happen. So I don't really view my role as like walking into a community and being like, you're gonna all tell me your stories. It's not really like that. It's sort of like, this is something that I now have that I can give as a gift. And I hope that it allows people the opportunity to think about their own positioning, their own communities, ways that their communities could be working towards reconciliation. And it's already happening. I've had a museum talk to me about telling better history. It's sort of a small town country museum. I know of a church that's recording healing songs with local Indigenous elders. And I hope the CRC is a way to bring them together so that we can have a sense of collective enthusiasm for all these wonderful things that are happening, and also inspiration for communities that are still thinking about what to do. So that's what I'm hoping for. When I started, I didn't really see myself as a researcher, which is funny now as a Canada Research Chair, but I was a kid from Foxhorn. So I didn't really think of research as a career. Most people in my community either became farmers or nurses or maybe teachers. So that's sort of my route. I think research is an incredible way to make a difference in your community. You can do it in a way that's collective, activist-oriented, working with people to help move together towards a good direction. And it can be fast-paced, it can be fun, it can be creative, all the things that I didn't know research could be. To someone who was just starting out, who was interested in that, I would say it can be those things, and it can be a lot of fun. When I started as an educator, I was an EAL teacher for just over a decade. During those years, I started to hear more and learn more about how racism affects people in my community. I'm a white woman with settler background. I didn't always know or recognize those things. I grew up in a pretty insular community. And so as I started hearing those stories, I think my eyes were opened a bit to people right next to me experiencing a very different life than what I experienced. Add on to that sort of foundation the fact that I'm now raising biracial children, the fact that as I was an EAL teacher, I started getting asked questions that were rooted in racism about Indigenous people in my community, and I didn't feel equipped to answer those questions from my students. So I had to start learning more for myself, start my own learning journey. And I think this idea that I want to build a better community, I want justice. I've always had kind of a social justice orientation, but I think things have progressed now to the point where we recognize that everyone has a role to play in reconciliation. Honorable Justice Murray Sinclair said in the Truth and Reconciliation report, education got us into this mess and education will get us out. And so this idea that education happens in many places, it's reflective of my own experience as I started learning about the history and legacy of residential schooling. I learned from places like TikTok, and I started reading, I started listening to people that I could find, Indigenous scholars, reading, hearing lectures, listening to elders and knowledge keepers in my community. And I started from like zero. We didn't know anything about residential schooling, even though there was a residential school in the town where my high school was. coming forward from that, I had to kind of cobble together all of these things. And so now, it's been a decade since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now people are learning in their own communities in many different places with this kind of more holistic way. Schools and post-secondary education systems are taking action towards the calls to action. There's still a long way to go, but things are farther ahead than a decade ago or farther. And so I think for me, it is personal. It doesn't feel like, I kind of questioned for a while, like, oh, I'm a white settler woman. Is this my role? But it is. I think it's everyone's role to play. And I don't think the burden of educating others should be only on Indigenous community members. And so if this is something I can do, I should do it. So right now, a lot of my work is on BU Cares website. So it's just www.bucares.ca. BU Cares is the research center here in the Faculty of Education at Brandon University.